Hello everyone and welcome to this new virtual program series new to the NGV, where we explore the most recent acquisitions to come into the NGV collection. My name is Sophie Gerard and I'm the Assistant Curator of Australian Art to 1980 at the NGV. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri and Woiwurrung people as the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to any Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be present today. As we're coming to you remotely, I would also like to acknowledge that people present in today's talk may be on the lands of other traditional custodians, and pay my respects to those communities wherever they may be. Today I will be discussing this painting here by Joy Hester, Pauline McCarthy from 1945. Which we acquired earlier this year. Firstly, I'm going to give you some background information on Joy Hester and her life at Heidi, surrounded by the artists working in that circle. I'll discuss some of the politics around these artists, including the lives of John and Sunday Reid, their benefactors. And then I'm going to move on to discuss the painting itself. So Joy Hester was born in Elsternwick in 1920. And went on to study drawing at the National Gallery School from 1937. The 1940s was really the time when we see Hester's career begin to take shape. This was when she became associated with the benefactors John and Sunday Reid and the group of artists centred at the Reid's home at Heidi. These artists, including Sidney Nolan, Arthur Boyd, Danila Vasiliev, Yossel Bergner, they all became incredibly instrumental to Hester's practice, and together they went on to be considered the most influential and significant group of artists of their generation in Australia. They're now known as the Angry Penguins group, and Hester was actually the only woman artist in this group at the time. John and Sunday both came from incredibly privileged positions financially. They bought Heidi in 1934 as a place where they could support artists and feed their passions of art collecting. John and Sunday opened their home to artists and poets and thinkers. They encouraged people to come and live with them and practice their crafts, and they really encouraged an alternative and bohemian way of living and working. The Reids were really considered the catalysts for so many of the most celebrated and recognised artists in our collection from that era. Aside from the Angry Penguins, many other artists frequented their home, including Fred Williams and Mercamora. Really, most artists of the modernist era of Melbourne were known to be at Heidi at some point in their careers. In the mid-1950s, the Reids established the Gallery of Contemporary Art, and in 1958 they relaunched the gallery as the Museum of Modern Art of Australia. And this eventually led to the formal establishment of the Heidi Museum. Although the Reids did live to see their vision fulfilled as Heidi becoming a public museum, unfortunately they both died really shortly after this came into effect. In December 1981, they died 10 days apart from one another after 50 years of marriage. John died from cancer and Sunday 10 days later by suicide. They are remembered as champions of modern art and literature and remain two of Australia's most important art benefactors. In her lifetime, Sunday was an incredibly intense person, and there was this sort of underlying contract that if you were to be involved in the Heidi home, then Sunday would really need to be an active presence within both your life and in your career. She'd become very personally attached to the artist and would really began to not really do anything by herself. She was incredibly close to all the people that came to and from Heidi, often becoming a lover to a lot of them. Her most famous relationship was with Sidney Nolan for a number of years. So this sort of developed a bit of a reputation throughout Melbourne, and a lot of artists began to avoid the Heidi circle because of this reputation. The group of artists that predominantly would live and work at Heidi, in particular Joy Hester, led really interesting and dramatic lives, which are now the subjects of novels and podcasts. Modern Love is one example of this. It's a book written by Kendra Morgan and Leslie Harding, the curators at Heidi Museum, which focuses on this group of artists and is currently being made into a major film. In 1941, Hester married Albert Tucker, and the two of them had a son, Sweeney. However, in 1947, Hester was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma and was told she only had a really short time left to live. So the same day that she received this news, Hester left Tucker and her son Sweeney and ran off with fellow artist and poet Grace Smith, who was also married at the time. Hester had had a lot of relationships during her marriage with Tucker, and so she probably wasn't planning on leaving him for Grace Smith, but her cancer diagnosis really sparked in her this sort of seize the day mentality, which contributed to her leaving her husband. The two moved to Sydney together and then returned the following year to live firstly in the Victorian countryside around Upwey, and then finally settling in Box Hill in 1956, where Joy opened her own studio. Because of what he saw at the time as being a huge betrayal from his wife, Tucker also left Australia for England very soon after Hester had left him. And so Hester and Tucker left Sweeney to be adopted by John and Sunday Reid. Sunday had had a hysterectomy very early on in life and was desperate to adopt a child. She'd actually raised this with many of the artists who were working at Heidi. She had asked Arthur and Yvonne Boyd and John and Mary Percival. Amazingly, both couples declined giving up one of their children, but she was overjoyed when Hester and Tucker left Sweeney in her care. Hester and Smith actually went on to have two children together, and Hester ended up dying from the cancer diagnosis in 1959, aged 40, a good 13 years after she was first diagnosed. So she ended up living quite a long life, a lot longer than the 2 years that she was originally prescribed. Sweeney, their son, also went on to live quite a difficult life. He suffered from addiction issues and had really tumultuous relationships with the Reids and also his birth parents. He fathered a number of children, the first of which when he was 18, and he ended up passing away in his early 30s from suicide. So yet another tragic and complicated story that is interwoven within this community of artists there at Heidi, which really adds another element to the darkness within a lot of the work that we see coming out of this period. Works by Hester in particular, which I will discuss later on. Like so many artists, so many women artists of the time, Hester wasn't celebrated during her lifetime. However, after her death, her first husband, Tucker, worked tirelessly to make sure her career and artistic reputation went noticed by the press and by galleries. And in her lifetime, she produced some of the most distinctive and intriguing imagery to emerge in Australia during the 1940s and 50s. So like a lot of artists working at the time, she focused on the inner aspects of the self. So this included pain and trauma and passion. All of these themes were really building in artistic circles internationally. In the wake of the Second World War, people were really tapping into the pain and suffering and the images that were coming out of what had happened during the war. This was when we saw the rise of Picasso in Europe, for example. Hester worked almost exclusively with brush and ink and focused on compelling psychological portraits and used drawing as a vehicle to grasp life in all of its complexities. She was really unafraid to explore subjects considered highly provocative during her lifetime. So themes of love and sex and birth and death were really common themes for her in her practice. According to many, these provocative themes that she kept on tapping into could have been part of the reason why she was under-recognized during her lifetime. These themes were particularly controversial, being produced by a woman, which may have contributed to the lukewarm reception that she received by her contemporary male critics. According to Heidi's senior curator, Kendra Morgan, Hester was one of the very few Australian women artists to what she says explore female sexuality and do so in a way that neither celebrates the female nude or eroticism, but rather interrogates the sensory and emotional conditions of deep connection and physical intimacy. So rather than explicitly show intimacy in her imagery, she went a little bit deeper, and her portraits are very psychological in their nature, very dark often. Hester often worked in series and created multiple images from the same theme. So this series here, Faces series, which she completed in 1947 and 1948, incorporate images from Nazi concentration camps that were coming out at the time, as well as tapping into the writings of the French philosopher Jean Cocteau, who was quite prolific in the 40s and 50s as he battled with his history of addiction. They have this real preoccupation with death, these images, and also draw on Hester's own experiences from the radiation treatment that she was receiving from her cancer diagnosis. So all of these narratives culminate in these harrowing works of suffering and loss. And even Hester herself referred to the Faces series as works, as frightening things, she said. And she said that she needed to take them off her wall almost immediately after having completed them. So in these works, we're really seeing this powerful and exposed human condition. A couple of more examples of the faces here. And another series she produced around the same time, between 1947 and 1949, are her Lovers series. In this series, she explored the complexities of sexual relationships between two partners. So again, we're really seeing this search for identity in this series, which also taps into social pressures on the role of women in the 1940s in Australia, the pressures on women to become homemakers and mothers and to give up their creative freedoms. The interconnectedness of being with another person is presented in this series in the shared eyes and then the shared mouths and the blurred boundaries between the heads. So the figures in these works, we're seeing at once a complete togetherness and a lack of boundaries, paired with this sense of separation and a loss of the self. We're also exposed to feelings of both despair and euphoria. So these real juxtaposed big human emotions are seen in the combination of these figures. At the time when Hester produced both the Faces and the Love series, she was undergoing radiation treatment in Sydney and living with Grace Smith in a small apartment. Their lives were extremely unstable. Economically, they almost solely relied on the regular payments from John and Sunday Reid, who were still supporting Hester in supporting her in her artistic practice. And Gray's and Joy's relationship was incredibly passionate and quite erotic. She told Sunday that her and Smith were two halves of the same person, the masculine and the feminine, and that together they created the whole. So we're really seeing that play out in the Lovers series and exploring that loss of a sense of self. And this is actually in stark contrast to Albert Tucker, who she had left. He was an incredibly disciplined person and quite the opposite of Gray. So her and Tucker had two distinct personalities between them, as opposed to Gray Smith and her, who sort of combined forces in their relationship. So the work that we've just acquired is a portrait of Pauline McCarthy. In many ways, it is a typical portrait by Hester, with this dark psychological element expressed on the model's eyes and in her hands. It's got this really moody palette and undertone to it. However, this is actually one of the only oil paintings of Hester known to exist, so it's an incredibly exciting thing to enter our collection. Pauline McCarthy, along with her husband Jack, owned a bookshop in Fitzroy. It was called the Kismet Lending Library, and it was located at 54 Johnston Street, which was actually Sydney Nolan's loft and located just across the road from the university. Kismet was a hangout spot for many artists at the time and was frequented by Tucker, Max Harris, Rosemary Good, Arthur Boyd. Boyd actually had his pottery studio very close by, so he was at the Kismet most days. So there was a real friendship circle that began to transpire at the bookshop, and everyone became really close. Gray Smith actually worked at this bookshop as a picture framer, and it was here that he and Hester first met while Tucker was on a trip away in Japan in 1947. So they would spend their weekends together at the bookshop and in the McCarthy's home. So it was a really significant moment in Hester's life, visiting Pauline and Jack at this bookshop. Pauline and Jack actually never ventured to Heidi, but they were very aware of the gossip in these circles, and particularly during her separation with Tucker and her cancer treatment. Joy Hester really leaned on Pauline during this time, and she became a real confidant to the artist. She appears in quite a few of Hester's works and was also painted by Tucker and Nolan on a few occasions. This is an example of a portrait by Albert Tucker of Pauline, and another one here by Joy Hester. So it was a really close-knit circle of friends. And as we can see in our portrait here, it's such an intimate portrayal of Pauline. This close friendship between her and Hester is so evident. The lack of background in this cropped composition really draws you into McCarthy's pensive expression and brings out the intensity, which is so common for Hester's work. The arm wrapped around the body there, this imbues feelings of warmth and of nurture, but can also be connected with the role of confidant that McCarthy ended up playing in Hester's life. There's also a bit of a suggestion there of a certain unease with that arm wrapped around her body, sort of reminiscent of much of Hester's practice there. So this is the 23rd work in the NGV collection by Hester, and it's the first oil that we've obviously acquired, so it actually makes it the first Joy Hester work to enter the Australian art collection at the NGV. It's currently on display in the permanent collection at the Ian Potter Centre, NGV Australia at Federation Square, and will also be on display in next year's portraiture exhibition, which opens in March 2022. I'd like to thank you for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed this program, and it has been a real pleasure introducing you to this work in the NGV collection. We really look forward to seeing you back in the gallery when we reopen, and we hope that you join us for our next New to the NGV program very soon. Thank you.